heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. Certain persons, by swerving from these, have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law, without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Now jump to verse 18. This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that by them you may wage the good warfare, holding faith and a good conscience. By rejecting these, some have made shipwreck of their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I've handed over to Satan, that they may learn not to blaspheme. Okay. I think, just like David read last week from Jude, I believe, it was good to read this text because when you think about what Paul is saying to Timothy, he's saying, I'm giving you a charge, a very specific command, and it's a very basic thing, actually, that faith issuing from a good heart, that issues from a good heart, pure heart, good conscience, sincere faith. It's pretty basic, but very difficult to keep the basic things. So as we study church history, you see people wander away from that. Wander away from just basic Christianity. And it's important to remember it and to keep it. So as we study this, you're going to see some factors now, because we're going to talk about Roman emperors. Okay, we're going to talk about Roman emperors. And you're going to see there are factors at work on the political sphere that's affecting Christianity in the short term and in the long term. So let me pray and then we'll jump into our lecture. Father, thank you for tonight. Thank you for today in the good weather and helping us to enjoy it, giving us work to do, giving us places, homes to be at and sleep, beds to sleep in, and friends, family, the church, the fact that we can have a meal tonight. Thank you for all these things. And I pray that you'll help us to listen to this lesson and learn about what's happened with your church over the years and how we can be better for it. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So, I have some notes here. Rome. Everything from, everything from Spain to northern Africa, up to north to Britain, over down to the east where Jerusalem are, the east where the Jerusalem is the Egypt is, and then you can continue on over toward India. This is all basically the Roman Empire. They control the Mediterranean Sea. They control the trade routes. The ports, everything. They're very, very wealthy, very strong. But it did not stay a unified whole. When Christianity came onto the scene and it started spreading throughout all the Roman Empire, thank you for making those roads, right? That made it easy for missionaries to travel on. They're traveling within a single united area, but it's up until like the 3rd or 4th century where they kind of have that, and then the empire splits into east and to west. And that's going to have a big impact on the church, on Christianity. I'm going to start with talking about a very important Roman emperor named Diocletian. Have you all ever heard of Diocletian? That's all right if you haven't. Have you ever heard of Nero? Yeah. Okay, so Nero was pretty bad, right? Maybe Diocletian was worse. Diocletian was bad. He was very bad. In 284 AD, he seized power of all of Rome. Very, very influential leader. He was a reformer. He believed that the Roman Empire needed to have political reform. But what he decided to do to make it more manageable is he divided the Roman Empire into two parts, east and west. Okay? Essentially, this resulted, practically speaking, this resulted in two empires, right? You have an Eastern Roman Empire, then you have a Western Roman Empire, but it eventually became just two. And here's why. Because you had your own Augustus in each one. And the word Augustus, we know that's Caesar Augustus, right? That comes from Octavius. Or Octavian was the adopted son of Caesar, and he had the title Augustus, which is maybe like honorable one or noble one, revered one in Latin, okay? So each one, the one in the east and the one in the west, would have that title. They would also have underneath them their own Caesar. That's like the second in line. So that may sound kind of weird to you. When I say Caesar, you automatically think that's the number one. That's actually not the number one when the empire divided. The number one was Augustus, and the number two was Caesar. When Augustus died, the Caesar became the new Augustus. Does that make sense? So there's two. There's two now. There's one Augustus over here, there's one Augustus over here, there's one Caesar over here, there's one Caesar over here. All right? And you already know one verse that's kind of coming to mind. It's a divided house that can't stand. And already you kind of get the feeling like this is...
And there's no way two human natures at two different places aren't going to bid themselves against each other.
Yeah. Two of them are going to fight.
We're better than you.
And then those two are going to fight within themselves. Is exactly what happens. So you have the East and the West that eventually want to fight. Then you have the West fighting within the West. And then you have the East fighting within the East. But it wasn't immediately like that, okay? He further divided the East and the West into 12 different provinces or dioceses. And he changed the court, changed civil law, changed the army structure. He made social and economic reforms that were so big, according to Nick Needham, the guy who wrote our study, he said it helped this empire last for another 1,000 years. So apparently he was pretty good. This is Diocletian at what he did. Diocletian was kind of, for the most part, tolerant a little bit to Christianity, but he didn't stay that way. And here's why. Because his Caesar, Diocletian ruled in the east. Okay, Diocletian ruled in his Caesar, his second, was a man named, let me see if I can pronounce this, Galerius. And he hated Christianity. He absolutely could not stand it. He was not tolerant to Christianity, and so they brought on the heat, according to this study, the most severe persecution that the church had ever seen. I'm going to read for you some of the edicts, some of the information of what they had to do if they came across like a presbyter, a bishop, a preacher, or a church building, and so forth. So listen to this. So Diocletian, he dismissed all Christians from the government and the army and issued 3 anti-Christian edicts in 303 and added a 4th one in 304. First edict is this: all church buildings were to be destroyed, all Bibles burnt, and all Christian worship forbidden. It would not be uncommon to hear a knock at the door, and they would be asking for the scrolls, or for the papyri, for the papers, or for the letters. And they knew what that would mean. That would mean something like, we want whatever copies of the Bible you have. And it was actually seen, if you handed over the Bible, if you handed over those, that was kind of your way of saying, I'm denying the faith. People treated that as apostasy. Because you got to imagine, it's not like they had, well, I got a Bible right here, I probably got several in the pew. I mean, they got like copies, and it's not easy to come across a copy. You gotta be there when it's read. You gotta ask for it. It's not just everywhere. They are growing, though. They are growing, but they're trying to stomp out the religion by getting rid of the book. Does that make sense? Very important not to hand over the papers, but some did anyway. So that was the first edict. Second edict: all clergy were to be arrested and imprisoned. Third, all clergy were to offer sacrifice to the gods or be tortured. And so that's what happened. So they would bring the clergy forward and they would say, well, here, you can take this pinch of incense or whatever. You can make sacrifice. You be safe. You're good. and they would refuse to do it, so they would torture them. Fourth, all citizens throughout the empire were to sacrifice to the gods or be executed if they refused. So this is a very clear persecution. This is targeted. Okay, this is all throughout the eastern part of the Roman Empire, but the western part's a little different at this point. There's more tolerance in the West for Christianity. Now, how did the Christians respond? They responded well. For the most part, they died. Many of them died. That's just, they kind of decided that they would not suffer. They would rather suffer than renounce their faith. Listen to what this man named Andronicus said when he was asked to sacrifice to the gods. They even shoved into his mouth the bread and the meat and made him. It was the bread and the meat that was offered to a pagan deity. They shoved it in his mouth and tried to make him eat it. And this is what he said. He said, "May vengeance fall upon you, savage tyrant, you and those who have empowered you to desecrate me with your unholy sacrifices. What you have done to God's servants will one day be revealed to you." Then the magistrate replied, "You monstrous evildoer, do you dare curse the emperors from whom the world has enjoyed so long in a deep peace?" Andronicus responds, "I have indeed cursed them and will do so again. They are public enemies, drinkers of blood, and they have turned the world upside down." I mean, that's just a great response. That's powerful stuff, isn't it? So, by and large, while the persecution's going on, you have people either resisting or just accepting the fact that they're going to be tortured. There's some brutal torture things in church history that you can read about and by a church historian named Eusebius, especially Blandina. I've mentioned Blandina before in the church service up in the pulpit. I haven't said out loud what happened to her because it's kind of really, you just need to read it. It's bad. People were abusing her in a very, very, very bad way, so much so that they would take turns over and over and over again until they wore themselves out abusing her, and she would not renounce her faith, and she just accepted death. So Eusebius, you can read about that. Galerius, so he took over in the east after Diocletian stepped down from being emperor, continued the persecution in the east. In the west, what's going on? Well, there's an emperor ruling named Constantius. You may have heard of Constantine. Anybody heard of Constantine? Yes. So Constantius, he was more tolerant, and his son, Constantine, eventually took over in the west, and he was somewhat tolerant as well. And I'll tell you the story of Constantine really quickly. Before I do, I should make this note. Galerius in the east, Galerius persecuting, eventually in 311, he gave up persecuting church and admitted I was unsuccessful. I couldn't stomp it out. Back over to the west. When this is kind of going on, 311, he admits, I couldn't stomp out the church. Constantine in 312, a war broke out between him and his right-hand man named Maxentius. So we're over here in the west. Constantine is emperor, and his second in command is not favorable to Christianity. Constantine sort of is, but they broke out into a war. So the west now is at war with itself. And you may have heard of the story of the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Has anyone ever heard of that story? The Battle of Milvian Bridge? No? That's okay. I'll tell you the story right now. So here's what happens, right? Constantine's going to battle against Maxentius, but he has a dream at night. I'm sure you've heard of this. He's had a dream at night, according to the historical records, right, that he saw in the heavens a sign. And with the sign, it said in Latin like in hoc signum vincit, or in hoc signum vincit, right? In this sign you will conquer, or by this sign you will conquer. And it was a sign of the Christian symbol, right? So it was either, I wish I could draw it for you. It was the Chi Rho, and it was either looking like a cross with like a little P above it. It's not really a P, it's a rho, or an X with a rho in the middle. Probably it was maybe that one. Some of you guys have seen probably tattoos, people with tattoos on their arms, and it looks like it's got a little X, and it's got a little P that goes down the middle. It's the first two letters of Christ in Greek. That's what it is, Christos, right? So you have the chi, and then you have the rho. If any of you guys are interested in getting a tattoo, there you go. There's your tattoo idea. It's kind of like the ancient version of the fish, okay?
Fun fact.
Yeah.
That is the X for Xmas.
Yep. Yeah, it is the X for Xmas. Keep Christ in Christmas. They are. It's just the chi.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. So, you guys who don't know Greek. All right. 3:12. He has a dream. Sees the sign. In this sign you will conquer. He wakes up and he tells all of his soldiers, we're going to paint that sign on the shields. So that's what they did. So they painted the sign on the shields. And then they went out to battle and won. Big time. Didn't win barely. Big time won. Constantine thinks, wow, the reason why. But up to this point, Constantine is a sun worshiper. He worshiped the sun god. And he now converts to Christianity because he realizes that I won because of the Christian God. I had this dream. I saw this sign. This is the sign for the Christian God. I won. I need to stop worshiping the sun god. I need to start worshiping the Christian God. And so he has a conversion, I guess. That is heavily debated, whether or not Constantine was really converted. I don't think there's any possible way we could know if he was converted or not. Let me give you some of the things he did, though, after that event. Well, first thing, when he returned back to the capital, he did something that was totally unexpected. He did not sacrifice to the gods for his victory. Instead, he erected up a statue of himself holding like a cross that says... has this inscription. I have saved your city and set it free from the tyrant's yoke by this sign of salvation, the true proof of heroic virtue. So instead of sacrificing to the gods, he makes a statue with like the Christian symbol that says this was the sign, this was the symbol that represents the true faith or whatever. So, but he did have some pretty bad things that he did as an emperor, like, for instance, this book, this author says that he killed several people that seemingly were innocent, possibly for political reasons or just in a rage. And that doesn't sound like something that a Christian would do. And I would say that's a very good thing to realize, right? We have no murderer has eternal life abiding within himself, 1 John. And then you have, of course, the event of his son, Crispus, which, real big red flag here. Apparently his wife, Constantine's wife, Faustus, Constantine's wife, accused his son, which was her stepson, accused Crispus of trying to make an advance toward her. Which is weird and nasty, just to think about. But apparently that's what's happening. Constantine gets very much enraged, doesn't allow Crispus to answer for himself, and kills him. So apparently Crispus, according to the wife, tried to rape her, and he got really mad and killed his own son. Probably not a good thing for a person confessing Christ to do. I'll get to some of the more positive things in a little bit, but there were some positive things that seemed to indicate maybe he did have some type of experience. But that's not the point, is it? That's not the point. Was he converted or not? The point is what he decided to do for Christians after that Battle of Milvian Bridge. Okay? And the main thing is Christianity became legalized. Christianity was no longer an illegal religion. But it wasn't out of the fire yet. So let me kind of build the story up a little bit more. So this is the West, right? We're around 311, 312 AD. Battle of Milvian Bridge, big deal. After 312 AD, we're seeing Christianity kind of made legal. Back to the East now. Okay, Galerius has stepped down. And now you have two rulers rise up for power, named Licinius and Maximinus. And they also had a war. Surprise, surprise. We talked about this, didn't we? We talked about how they're divided and they were going to fight with each other. Licinius was very similar to Constantine, more tolerant for religious freedom. In fact, Licinius and Constantine met together and decided we need to have toleration for, this is in 313 AD, we should have toleration for Christianity across the empire, right? So that means, finally, no more burning of churches, no more torturing of presbyters, bishops, or preachers, no more sacrificing to the gods. You are allowed to worship how you want. It's not a required religion. That's not a required religion. It's just you can do this without fearing for your life. Okay? But the problem with that is Licinius, even though he was kind of okay with that at first, his second in command, Maximinus, was not okay with that. And eventually, Licinius was okay with it. He became enraged. He was also a pagan. He wasn't a Christian. Constantine was claiming Christianity. So Licinius eventually dismissed all Christians from the army and became more hostile. And he also decided he wanted to start a persecution in 320. So that's only 7 years later. He destroyed buildings and put many parishioners to death. So Constantine said, well, we got to deal with him the same way we dealt with Maxentius, right? We agreed for religious toleration. Religious toleration is not being practiced, right? And so what do we need to do? We need to go to war. Lots of wars going on. And so, but now this war is different, right? This isn't within the East and this isn't within the West. This is West coming back to East. And so Constantine sees himself as basically trying to set the church free. Okay, set the church free. So he goes to war. Made war on him at 320, and he overcame Licinius at Chrysopolis. At that moment, in 320 AD, Constantine became the sole emperor of all of the area, of all of Rome. Okay? Still has his capital in the east. Now, let me pause here just for a second. Putting Constantine's conversion to the side for a second. We'll talk more if it was like a legitimate conversion or not. Christians are almost able to enjoy religious freedom, something that you and I have taken, we take advantage of all the time, and take for granted. This has not been the case. This has simply not been the case historically. To be able to meet in a building, to have your own building, the fact that it's a building away from the home and it's not within the home is like, in many places, in many countries, even today, that's an anomaly. That's not a normality, right? That's just odd to have its own building. If you do go and meet at one location, you got to do this secretly in some countries today. You can't be caught. And they don't like Christian gatherings, and so you can have people over at the house, but you can still be caught there too. So it's starting to have buildings, starting to have a more organized form of religion. When Christianity was legalized, you have people feel more freedom to kind of do things and I guess let their hair down a little bit if you want, stretch out a little bit more. They can elect officials, and people can be elected now to the clergy without as much threat. You see how that could be a good thing, but you could also see how that it can maybe result in something that's not so good, right? There's not as much skin in the game now. There's not as much risk. And so when there's not as much risk, let's just use an example. Let's just use this as an example for our modern day. You can go into some workplaces today and claim all sorts of reasons for just simply being lazy and not showing up to work. You could say, I didn't show up to work for a week straight because I'm depressed, et cetera, et cetera. If you said that like 20 years ago, like probably 20 years ago, you'd have been fired, right? Like, well, you're not coming to work, you have to be fired. Now there's no risk of being fired is what I'm trying to say. In many workplaces, there's just no risk. You can just almost get away with murder, right? And you're still, if you can claim it to some type of mental instability, you'll be welcome back as soon as you can get back on track. You see, there's just no problem. There's no fear of being let go. When the church enjoys this freedom, it has very good things develop. Theology has the opportunity to both kind of have some refinement with its confessions and councils and so forth, but it also has opportunity for heresies to come up. And it also has opportunity for people to deny the faith and maybe slip back in later. Okay? So that's just food for thought. Let me explain more about Constantine. I've already mentioned what he did when he came back from the war from Milvian Bridge. Now he's the sole ruling emperor, if you will. Here are some good things that he did. Okay? First, he made Sunday a day of rest. He didn't require people to worship, but he realized, right, Christians worship on Sunday because of why? The resurrection, right? The resurrection. And hey, this can be a day of rest and worship. He allowed the construction of church buildings without the fear of them being burnt down. All right. He allowed, this is an interesting one, and I actually like this one. I know that this I guess could create some controversy, maybe even in this audience, but I like it now. You can convince me otherwise. But he allowed bishops, pastors, to settle legal disputes if the parties wanted to go to a church to settle them. And I do like that quite a bit, because if you go and read 1 Corinthians chapter 5, Paul, there's actually a command, right? If a church member has a grievance against another church member and it's a legal grievance, they were going to court to try to sue each other or to try to deal with this on the political sphere in front of the world, and Paul rebukes them. Paul is saying, like, what are you doing? Why are you going to the courts to settle your legal disputes? You should not do that. Go to the church to settle it. And I just think, how many churches do you see doing that today? You know, think about that. Because then Paul goes on to say, don't you know that you're going to judge angels? I mean, and how much more you're going to hand your judgment case over to the world, which doesn't know justice from injustice at all? You're going to let them decide, right? And they're wicked. They're not even pursuing Christ. And Paul was like, you should be settling this within the church. So anyway, Constantine is saying, bishops, you can have a place in the social world, in the political sphere to some degree, by deciding judiciary cases, okay? Now, I mean, obviously that has some drawbacks, doesn't it? Because then you have the church now that's kind of being more involved in the state, which you know what happens from that, right? You know what corruption comes in, it seems, very quickly through the state into the church. And then it becomes indistinguishable. You have church and state so mixed up that it begins to lose its own, later on in church history, it loses its own purity. But just on the surface, I really kind of like this idea to some degree. To some degree, it's biblical. Okay. He introduced state welfare. He forbade crucifixion as a form of punishment. You can no longer crucify people, which is still going on. He banned branding criminals. They would sometimes brand them in the face, but they would take, hot iron, brand them, and mark them. And he banned that because he felt like it was a desecration of the image of God in the form of man. He tried to outlaw, according to this study, the gladiator games. which was a big atrocity, but he was unsuccessful to completely stop that. And that happened later during an emperor named Honorius, I think was his name. That was when it ended. Big thing that he did, that Constantine also did, he moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Byzantium, which was also called Constantinople. I'm sure you've heard of Constantinople. Why is that important? Because later Rome fell, right? In 410 AD, Rome ended up falling, but the eastern part of the empire, you're the east over here, Byzantium, did not fall. It eventually came the Byzantine Empire. So, despite though all the good you might say that Constantine did, paganism was still the dominant religion. Most people were still pagan. Not everybody shared Constantine's religious convictions. I will say, despite all the political and social and economic things that Constantine did, he also leaned into the religious aspect. He started influencing the church and having an opinion about what the church believed. So there were several heresies that were kind of coming to a head, and there needed some organization from the church, from the top, that said, well, what are we going to do to address some of these heresies? Are they true? Like the Arian heresy, the Donatist heresy, Donatism. What are we going to do about these, and how do we address them? Constantine would call for councils. And he said, we need to deal with these things. And they would bring out from those councils a confession or some type of creed, and that would be the Orthodox confession. Now, I am not going to go into those tonight, because what I want to do is I want to take a whole session of dealing with some of, I think, the most important heresies in the early church. And it was around this time of Constantine. And here's why I want to deal with that in one lesson, then I'm going to conclude, okay? Because there's nothing new under the sun. There's just nothing new under the sun. And when we talk about Arianism and what it is, you're going to say, oh, that's Jehovah's Witness, that's Mormonism. And you're going to be exactly right. We're going to talk about the spread of heresies and how heresies were spread. You'll see that they're spread just by catchphrases and cheap hymns and just knockoff theology, stuff that's just real Coke and candy Christianity, you know? And it's just watered way down, and there's nothing new under the sun. You're seeing it repeated in history over and over and over again. I'll give you a story, okay, and then I'll close. I don't know how many years ago this was. Maybe it was, let's see, at least 6 years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years. Tim O'Day and I, y'all know the name Tim O'Day, right? Timothy O'Day. We support him in Salt Lake City. We were sitting together in my living room, and he's a very smart guy. Timothy is a very, very intelligent guy. He studied a lot. And we were talking with these Mormons. And we were it was just back and forth with them for the longest time. And I'm like, I was in my home, so I'm like, we can go as long as you want, but you're the one that's got to ride a bike home or whatever. They drove. But that's a funny joke. So we were talking to them, and it was great. And then they left. But before they left, they, in defense of their faith, cited someone from church history that in support of their view of Jesus, that he was a creature, right? And something like this was something of the quote where he said, and a man stood up and said, "What have they done with my Lord? What have they done with my Lord?" And the guy that was saying that was actually a heretic, because he was believing something wrong about Christ. The Mormon was citing that guy as one of his heroes, okay? Well, they ended up leaving. And then Timothy O'Day and I were debriefing about it afterwards. And I haven't studied church history apparently like him. And I think he's right about this, but I don't know the source. I'd love to find out exactly where it says. But he said to me, he goes, you know the guy that he was citing, where he said, "What have they done with my Lord? What have they done with my Lord?" I was like, yeah. He goes, I think that was Arius himself. I think that was Arianism. I think he's citing the main heretic from church history as his hero. And I was like, there's nothing new under the sun. And I was like, that's I'm glad you know that, because I didn't know that. We should have brought that up. So anyway, we'll talk more about that next time, and see kind of how Christianity grew when it's legal. And eventually it's going to become the state religion. Eventually they're going to require you to be Christianity or a Christian, and then by the time you get to Charlemagne, if you're not bowing the knee to Jesus, they're cutting off your head. So that's not happy times. But on that note, let's pray and ask the Lord to bless the food, and we'll conclude. Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for our study, and help us to learn once again from church history. Just to be aware, Lord, help us to continue to study and be aware for spiritual warfare. Help us to remember, Father, there's nothing new under the sun. And so as we study about these, the errors of the past, we'd also see the successes and the victories, and that we would learn from those. Be with us tonight. Bless the food, Lord, and bless our time of fellowship together, and help us to go from this place safely and go to our work and jobs and our families, and with your blessing.